Thank you all for coming this morning. Obviously, an interesting topic and a lot of stuff in the news. Unfortunately, Aaron Miller couldn't make it because he broke his thumb. So I'm going to have to try to fill in a little bit for him. He sent me some points to make. And I mean, the reason we wanted Aaron is because he helped plan 5 Middle Eastern summits. So he had a lot of experience, and anyway, we'll try to soldier on without him. So today we have, I think all of you know Suzanne and myself, and we're going to talk about the summit, talk about some of the things we had in our article that was published in Politico. I guess it's 2 weeks ago now?
It's only been 1 week.
Oh, it's only been 1 week.
But
okay.
My God, it feels like
It feels
a year.
like a long time ago. Plus, it appeared on a Saturday night for about an hour, and then it disappeared. So anyway, for those of you who missed it, who weren't looking at Politico minute by minute, talk a little bit about that and talk a little bit about what's in the news in the past week or so. So I think the way we'll proceed is Suzanne will talk first, and then I'll follow, and then we can have a discussion and questions. Yeah.
Great. So thank you, Joel, for organizing this. Justin, thank you for your keen assistance in pulling this together. And thank all of you for coming here. I think when we wrote our article, I think it was published 9 days ago, of course, a lot of things are moving fast. But I think the main points we made still hold, and I'm just going to go over a few of them. But first, I do want to say that I think for some of us who've long supported diplomatic talks to address the North Korean crisis, the news of a summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, I think, brought about what I would call a be careful what you wish for moment. Are these two leaders, both of whom I would call untested leaders on the global stage, are they ready for such high-stakes diplomacy? And I think that was one of the big questions we had to grapple with. I mean, usually when you have these sort of encounters, presidential summits, especially between adversaries, they usually take place after a fair degree of groundwork for negotiations or some concrete set of deliverables have been agreed to. Otherwise, you run the risk of the more powerful party being seen as giving away unearned concessions to the other side, or you run the risk of becoming more of a spectacle than actual substance, which I think is a big risk here. And more seriously, I guess one of my concerns is that what would happen if the summit isn't a success? What if it's a failure? I think that would likely damage the prospects for future diplomacy, possibly in an irreversible way, and it could make unviable, what I would call unviable military options suddenly appear unavoidable. So I think that's the worst case scenario, and we really need to work to avoid that. So despite all these concerns, I must give President Trump credit for taking a bold step towards diplomacy. I think it's a welcome turn of events, given the dangerous cycle of escalation and high rhetoric we've been witnessing between Washington and Pyongyang over the past months, including a lot of talk about war, military options. So if the summit comes to fruition, I think it could result in a historic breakthrough. And my own point of view is we must now do everything we can to ensure it's a success. So, of course, for any chance of success, the Trump administration now is faced with the task of having to carefully manage the very short period of time between now and the summit. A fixed date has yet to be determined, but I think the general time frame is late May. Of course, that could change, but let's move forward on the presumption that that's when it'll happen. So the administration now has to quickly carry out a great deal of preparatory work, and we already see some early moves in the right direction. Since the summit was first proposed, there is a de-escalation in tensions, a cooling down in the fiery rhetoric. I think the personal insults that were being traded have stopped, at least for now. We'll have to see if that's a temporary thing. The other move in the right direction is we haven't seen a missile test by the North Koreans since November 29th. So we're almost at the 4-month mark. And of course, the other positive step is after many months of mixed messaging by this administration, contradictory statements by various administration officials, I think there's been some progress on trying to communicate a coherent U.S. policy, an emphasis on diplomacy while keeping pressure in place. Previously, I think the contradictory statements heighten the risk of misperception, also the risk of miscalculation, so this is obviously a step in the right direction. And then, of course, arguments favoring military action have been muted. At least for now, there seems to be an effort to make room for diplomacy, but that could change if things do not go the right way. There are many challenges ahead. I think the administration clearly needs to do a better job of working with allies. I think the president's tweet on South Korea, which seemed to imply a veiled threat of maybe pulling our soldiers from the peninsula at this very critical moment when they're involved in their own high-stakes diplomacy. I think this was really music to Kim Jong's ears, and right now I think there should be a clear indication that we are proceeding in close coordination with our allies and partners, especially South Korea. And I know over the weekend, senior representatives from the U.S., South Korea, and Japan met in San Francisco. Another challenge is how will this administration forge a robust diplomatic strategy that will require the whole of government? It must be an interagency process. This won't be easy. The hollowing out of the State Department is obviously a challenge. The fact that we have a change in lead diplomat, Rex Tillerson, soon will be stepping down. And administration officials with expertise about North Korea and experience dealing with North Koreans more specifically are practically non-existent at this point, which I think puts us at a real disadvantage. And the other challenge is what I would call how to soundproof this process from President Trump's rhetoric and tweeting. I know in the past his rhetoric has derailed efforts to get talks started, especially since the Oslo meeting in May that I was involved with. I think we should expect many bumps in the road ahead. So how to soundproof the process? I think placing the process in the hands of a senior U.S. official, I would assume at this stage it will be Pompeo, I think would be one way to do that. So the president isn't involved necessarily on a day-to-day basis in these details. So a key goal of pre-summit preparations should be to set the groundwork for what I would call sustained, productive talks, while at the same time continuing to test the North Korean seriousness. I think the North Koreans have played their cards quite well. Kim Jong-un at this point seems to be at least setting the agenda and the pace, while the Trump administration is reacting and trying to catch up. So I think the administration needs to move quickly to change this dynamic. In the article that Joel referred to, we strongly recommended ASAP, a face-to-face bilateral meeting at a senior level. Of course, at the time, we said this should be between Rex Tillerson and North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, but life comes at you fast, and here we are. So we would now probably change that to Secretary, well, he's not confirmed yet, but Mr. Pompeo. In either case, whether it's Mr. Tillerson or Mr. Pompeo, both would face a steep learning curve in preparing for such a meeting. Ri Yong-ho is a very seasoned diplomat, the leading expert in North Korea on the United States. also has been the lead negotiator during the six-party talks. So he's been doing this for quite some time, and also his team has been doing this for quite some time. So I think the meeting would be an opportunity for this senior official to convey to the North Koreans on behalf of President Trump that regime change is not U.S. policy. Also an opportunity to clarify the U.S. policy of maximum pressure while emphasizing engagement is the preferred way forward. And then other priorities in an initial meeting should be solidifying the continuation of the suspended nuclear and missile testing while talks are underway, and establishing a reliable channel for direct communications going forward. I also think securing the release of the 3 imprisoned Americans as a humanitarian gesture should be a priority. In my own opinion, I think this probably should have been secured before President Trump actually agreed to the summit, but here we are. And I think finally, and perhaps most important, the issue on an initial meeting would be to codify North Korea's stance on denuclearization. As we mentioned in the article, we strongly disagree with those analysts that are suggesting we should drop this as a goal of negotiations. That doesn't make sense to us, especially when the North Koreans themselves have conveyed that denuclearization would be on the agenda. As Foreign Minister of South Korea said just yesterday on Face the Nation, they have received, what did she call it? Not promises, but maybe assurances directly from Kim Jong-un that this would be an agenda point. So, of course, I think the United States needs to clarify that and get some reassurance that that indeed will be the case. The other thing I would emphasize is inter-Korean dialogue, which is actually happening now, and this summit between North and South Korea is actually expected to take place before the Trump-Kim summit. So we need to make sure whatever we do, it's on a complementary track to that summit and the preparations for that. And again, the importance to coordinate closely with our South Korean allies. I really wish we had an ambassador in Seoul, but we do not at the moment. I think this coordination is very important because they will try to split us, and I think coordination is the way to prevent that. There are other ideas we listed in the article which we can go through maybe through the course of the Q&A. But I think there are certainly, once the process gets started, a number of key issues that should be addressed earlier rather than later that show promise. Just briefly, I would say one is getting to a point of a common set of principles on how to move the discussion forward. And of course, this is well-tread ground. We've been through this before with the North Koreans. There are already a set of principles that have been agreed to in past discussions, and I think we could borrow heavily from that. I think second is to really pursue with the North Koreans their parallel goals of economic development and a robust nuclear program. What do they plan to do now that they've declared the completion of their nuclear force? Are they indeed going to turn their attention to economic development? I think that's a line of discussion we should be pursuing with them early on. Third, throughout my informal talks with the North Koreans, consistently over these past 2 years, they have said that they would be open to discussing in official talks matters related to nonproliferation, specifically offering assurances that they will not transfer or sell nuclear weapons, nuclear material, as well as chemical and biological weapons. So I think that is a set of issues that are ripe for discussion. And then I think I will stop there, but I guess our key point was that the administration, in order to make this date of May for the summit, now needs to scramble to get prepared for what's shaping up to be probably the most important diplomatic encounter of Trump's presidency. So I think it's an opportunity to develop and commit to a diplomatic strategy to manage uncertainties ahead. We need to fully test if diplomacy can work and must exhaust every option that we have on this track. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Suzanne. This is a little awkward because I have to present Aaron's stuff, and I'm not a Middle East expert, but I think some of it is very relevant here. And you hear a lot from people about the summit, and mainly Korea experts. And I think what's interesting is Aaron had experience planning 5 Middle Eastern summits over a decade. And I think there are a lot of interesting lessons from those. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to come back to the North Korea issue, because I had just a few additional things to say beyond what Suzanne said. So the first point I thought was very interesting in what Aaron said was that, he participated in these 5 summits. There was a lot of talk beforehand, a lot of negotiation, a lot of meetings, and yet 4 out of 5 were failures. So of course, if you're just meeting with the president and Kim Jong-un, that may increase the chance of failure, but even having a process leading up to a summit, you still can fail. Secondly, Aaron says form follows function. So that means what is the summit designed to achieve? And of course, we've talked a little bit about that in our article. What are the objectives of a summit? And he says they're usually good for one of 2 things, either launching a process or closing one out with an accord. So in this case, there's not going to be an accord, but I think a much more doable objective is actually launching a process. Secondly, Aaron says create an investment trap. And I think by that he means that you need to create a process that serves all sides' needs and in which no party will be blamed for sabotaging it. So in the case of the Middle Eastern summits, and particularly the Madrid summit, they created sufficient incentives to move forward, and there weren't a lot of disincentives to move forward. And, an important point, I think, is that summit in particular was successful, and that's the only decade when there wasn't a major Middle Eastern war. So a summit can really set the tone for many years after it's taken place. Another one that's really relevant to today is he said, even in the Middle Eastern case, there's no way you can script a leaders' summit. You can prepare, you can have meetings, you can have understandings with whoever's in charge, but at the end of the day, when they get in the room, leaders are likely to do what leaders do, which is make decisions and make calculations, sometimes on their own. And it's not clear to the staff beforehand what those might have been in their own minds. Fourth, have a plan B. Well, of course, that's very relevant to this summit. He points out that at Camp David, they didn't have a plan B. And as a result, that created a lot of conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. And so that's exactly what we need here, is a plan B. If things don't go according to what we think they should go, what's the fallback? And it sounds like common sense, but in talking to Aaron, he said they never really thought about it. They never really discussed it in planning the summit. And the last thing is, don't shut parties out. And in the case of the Middle East, it was mobilizing key Arab states. Here, it's obviously our allies, number one, but also China. I think the administration needs to make a concerted effort to bring China into the process. And maybe that includes, senior level meetings with Chinese officials, or even trying to convene some sort of multilateral meeting before the summit that includes the Chinese too. I've heard informally they may be open to that. The last issue I wanted to address, which it's in the news a lot, and already a few people have asked me about this, is what about this Helsinki meeting? The people involved are all very capable, very professional people. Remember that these meetings are set up months ahead of time. So, when this meeting was set up, I'm willing to bet my house that no one knew there was going to be a summit. And secondly, to me, it would be very strange if the governments involved use this kind of meeting to help prepare for a summit. I think the most you might hear from the North Korean official there, who is not senior level, is some sort of reaffirmation about what they've told the South Koreans. But I think that would be the most. And I know everyone's looking around and saying, well, gee, where are these summit preparations happening then? Well, there was an interesting article the other day about an intelligence channel between the United States and North Korea. I know that channel has existed since 2009, which is 9 years ago. There have been ongoing contacts between the United States intelligence community and the North Korean intelligence community since 2009. And I think they started then in preparation for President Clinton's visit to North Korea that summer to retrieve the two American journalists. And if you go back and do a little bit of research, you'll see reports in 2012 of visits by senior level CIA officials to North Korea to discuss other issues. And then, of course, in 2014, James Clapper, who was the director of national intelligence, visited North Korea as well. I suspect that was set up through intelligence contacts. The last point to make is I noticed in that article there was a lot of talk about the North Korean official who the Americans are in contact with, Kim Yong-chol, who was head of the General Reconnaissance Bureau during the time that the Cheonan was sunk, and also recently visited South Korea. Well, in fact, he has been the main contact in this channel for much of the time that I've described to you. Last point, it's good to have these kinds of contacts, but it's not ideal. And I want to not be undiplomatic here, but it's one thing to be an intelligence analyst. It's another thing to be a diplomat and a policymaker. It's like if I was the captain of an aircraft carrier and you asked me to be a diplomat, I'd probably have trouble figuring it out if I had never been a diplomat before. And so that's a problem. That's a drawback here. So I think using an intelligence channel for these preparations, while it's good that there is a channel, it has serious drawbacks. And the last point, which Suzanne has made, and I want to second, is that there is no substitute for face-to-face experience in dealing with North Koreans. I could sit in my office day after day reading KCNA and every other official North Korean publication and think that I'm learning a lot. And you are, but it's different when you meet them face-to-face. You'll hear a lot of that stuff from the official media, but you'll hear a lot of other stuff too. And it's also important because, as Suzanne has said, the North Koreans who are preparing the summit have decades of experience in terms of face-to-face contact and negotiations with Americans. Decades of experience. I first met the foreign minister, the current foreign minister, in 1995 when he came to New York to negotiate the light water reactor supply agreement with the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization. And the others, such as now Vice Minister Chae Sung-hee, she has a couple of decades of experience, too. So these people really know the United States. They understand the United States. They've, of course, met many Americans over these decades and know how to talk to Americans and understand Americans, too. And on top of that, they are professionals. They have their own national interests in mind all the time. And I'm sure they're the ones behind the planning for this summit. So it's a cautionary note that you can't just send some intelligence analysts off to meet with North Koreans and think that that's going to work well. So I'm going to stop here and invite questions, comments. There's always that initial hesitation when no one raises their hand, so thank you.
Nick Bottoms with Bloomberg. I just have two questions. One, I'm sure you've answered this a lot, but the first is whether you took the offer from North Korea to give up its nuclear program as conveyed through the South Koreans at face value, or if that sort of goes against everything you've ever concluded in your conversations with North Koreans, if that offer strikes you as genuine or if there's an ulterior motive behind that. And the other is there anyone you can think of in the U.S. government currently who is working on these issues who's actually met a North Korean person?
Thank you. So on your first question, whether or not I took denuclearization at face value, of course not. I think it's an issue that we have to constantly test the North Koreans and test their seriousness. But on the other hand, if we think about why are the North Koreans entering into talks now in terms of the timing, we may get a different answer. Of course, the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration, the sanctions, have been a factor in the decision. But I would not say it's been pivotal. And by that I mean, in other words, pressure and sanctions alone would not have gotten us to the point that we are today. I think there are two other factors that are far more important. The second is the diplomacy conducted by the South Koreans and President Moon, particularly the offering the North Koreans an off-ramp through the Olympics, the Olympic pause, and getting diplomacy on track. The South Koreans did a great deal of heavy diplomatic lifting, and I would say finessing to get us to this point. But I would say the third factor is the most important, and that is the North Koreans' progress on their nuclear and missile program over this past year, a hydrogen bomb test, and 3 ICBM tests, the last one which had a projected range that could hit any target in the United States. I think that the fact that Kim Jong-un could say at the end of 2017 what he said he would say at the beginning of 2017, he said, by the end of this year, we will complete our nuclear force. Now, we can debate whether or not he really has the capability. Does he have the reentry capability to actually hit us with a nuclear weapon? But I think that's besides the point. I think they feel a great sense of confidence that they've made these accomplishments. Also, they understand that it has greatly enhanced their negotiating position. So I think they have a keen understanding that that negotiating position is as strong now as it's going to be. So I think that is why they're entering into talks now. So in terms of your question, I think they also understand that even when they say denuclearization, they mean a process to get there. And what we need to find out is if they're serious, how long? Are they talking about a year, 5 years, 10 years? And I think that's what we need to be pursuing. And in terms of your second question, which was, I forget what it was now. Oh, I only know one person, and that is Allison Hooker, who is at the National Security Council. She accompanied Ivanka Trump to the Pyeongchang Olympics, but she has been serving, I think, in several administrations now, and has actually met North Koreans face to face.
Let me just quickly add a couple of points. First, on the denuclearization point. In fact, although no one has really paid attention, they've said this periodically since at least 2013 in very high-level government statements, one in the summer of 2013, one in the summer of 2016. They don't just do those for fun. I mean, they're not a diversion. And privately, they've been talking about it too. So, for example, in 2013, the fall of 2013, at a meeting I was at, a senior North Korean official outlined a phased process of denuclearization. And not just denuclearization, of course, but what they would want in return. And that goes to the point which Suzanne has made, and I think many of us have made, that it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a long-term process. It's a goal of a negotiation, just as the end of U.S. hostile policy will be a goal, a long-term goal for the North Koreans in any negotiation. So if we look at it that way, then it's possible, although we don't know if we're going to get to the end of the rainbow there. The idea that we should drop that goal, I think, is really ridiculous. You know, why would we drop that goal, enter into a negotiation, and then let the North Koreans essentially keep their weapons without any pressure from us because we've dropped the goal? Doesn't make any sense at all. David?
Thank you. You mentioned that in relation to Helsinki, that the most that could be perhaps expected was an affirmation of what the North Koreans had told the South Koreans. Isn't that actually quite important to hear that directly? At the moment, we're relying on what the South Koreans are saying, and they maybe have a motive to paint it in a certain way.
I think it's important for all of you, but I suspect there are channels in which the United States government is hearing things like that. And I think certainly as I can't see if there are any Korean reporters here, but Korean reporters know that for every time there's an important North-South meeting, it's arranged by the National Intelligence Service. So they have active channels of communications. Even in the most conservative Korean governments, have been active channels of communications. And I'm sure that's what they're hearing in that channel and sharing with the United States. So yes, if you want to hear a Korean official say that publicly, or in this kind of private track 1.5 meeting, sure. I suspect you will hear it publicly once the date and place has been worked out for a summit.
And can I just add something quick to that? I think as we move forward, I don't think we should expect the North Koreans to be saying much about the summit itself and the process. I think this is typical for them to be quite reserved on this, not speaking publicly about it, and I don't see that changing.
Just to follow up, Joel, you mentioned a meeting in which a North Korean official had outlined to you the phased process and what they would want in return. Can you explain a little bit about what they were seeking back in 2013?
Yeah, sure, it's not a problem. I mean, a lot of people say, what do they mean by hostile policy? And I guess for people who actually sit down and talk to them, like Suzanne and myself, it's very obvious, very clear what they mean. So if you ask a North Korean, well, what do they want in return in that process? You need to look at political steps, economic steps, and security-related steps. So, for example, if you're talking about political steps, you would need to see movement towards normalization of relations between the United States and North Korea. If you're talking about economic steps, that's very obvious, you know, start lifting sanctions. If you're talking about security steps, that's very obvious too, moving towards a peace treaty. More recently, we heard, and I think Suzanne has heard too, more details on what they mean about that process of moving towards a peace treaty, which is a long-term process. So you can, if you look at the record of these private meetings, I think they reflected a stream of thought, not the dominant stream of thought, but a stream of thought among officials, some officials in North Korea that may now be part of their game plan.
Tim Shorak from The Nation. I think it was a week ago, Pompeo, when he was put on CBS to explain what was going to happen, mentioned U.S. has made no compromise whatsoever. And obviously, sending Trump is a big compromise. But what about the military exercises? I mean, I've been reading in the South Korean press that there's reports that the strategic bombers and aircraft carriers and submarines will not participate in these exercises. So while the U.S. may be saying publicly we're not backing down on this issue, and Kim Jong-un said he would understand the military exercises, do you expect to be, or have you heard that there's going to be some kind of, downgrading of the exercises? Well, obviously they're probably going to continue in some form.
I actually think there's going to be an announcement in the coming day or so about this, maybe today, actually. But my understanding is that the exercises will resume on or around the beginning of April. And I think you're right, Tim, they will be toned down in both size and scope. I don't think the United States will describe it as a concession. I would describe it more as setting the right atmosphere for talks. And I think if we look at it that way, it makes a great deal of sense.
Don't you get a feeling that there's a choreographer here, you know, who's planning all the dance steps?
I think it's the South Koreans.
And, you know, you have Kim Jong-un saying, well, gee, I don't really care about exercises, wink, wink. And then you have Pompeo saying, gee, we haven't compromised, wink, wink. So obviously there's something going on here beneath the surface, I think through, you know, certainly the South Korean contacts in the intelligence channels with North Korea.
Can I ask a follow-up on Pompeo? Seems to me, he made a pretty important speech about a month ago at the American Enterprise Institute, where he talked in great detail about, about North Korea and what the U.S. expects and may do. But it seemed to me that he was kind of responding to the North Koreans saying they're not going to test anymore. I mean, that was sort of the undercurrent of what he was saying, I think. But it seems to me that the CIA has been playing a pretty prominent role, regardless of the recent appointment. I mean, they even had about a year ago or so, there was a event at Georgetown where two senior people from the CIA Mission Center spoke, and I thought that was quite unusual for anybody from the mission centers to speak by name, especially. So do you think, in fact, they have been playing this kind of prominent role?
No, you can go ahead.
You know, it's not just in this administration. You look at the Obama administration, for example. CIA people were working at the NSC on North Korea policy and at the State Department. There was a gentleman who you probably know, Tim, Sid Seiler, who was there for quite a while. Typically what happens, I believe, inside the U.S. government is they all, you know, when something happens with North Korea, everyone looks around at each other and says, who knows something about North Korea? And most people just sort of sit there and go, I don't know anything. And they turn to the CIA, to the intelligence community as the sort of repository of knowledge about North Korea. So this is a very typical thing, I think, inside the U.S. government.
But I think since the Trump administration came into office, it was under Trump that they've set up this new North Korea Mission Center at the CIA. So obviously putting not only more financial resources into it, but more manpower and womanpower into it. And the fact that Mr. Pompeo was heading CIA throughout this process makes good sense. And I think if you look at the timing of the demise of Mr. Tillerson and the naming of Mr. Pompeo, it's clear as we've moved closer to actual talks that our president feels much more comfortable with Mr. Pompeo conducting or being involved in those discussions at a high level. I think that was a critical factor to the timing of the ouster of Mr. Tillerson. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. And from the North Koreans' point of view, I haven't had a chance to talk to them directly about this, but I would assume that they're quite happy with this switch. I think they did have some doubts about Mr. Tillerson's role as our chief diplomat, particularly concerns about the relationship with President Trump. And now, even though Mr. Pompeo is clearly more hawkish, at least in his words, I think they see someone who actually has a close relationship with the president, access to the president, maybe even someone the president might listen to. And I think they probably understand that that's important.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Eugene from Kyoto News correspondent, and I'd like to ask about your experience to dealing with North Korea. So, how do you expect North Korea will release three U.S. citizens detained in North Korea before the summit?
Well, as you know, Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho was just in Stockholm. And the Swedes do serve as the U.S. protecting power in North Korea. So at least theoretically, they're the diplomats responsible for keeping an eye on our detainees. So I think they're constantly playing the role of trying to get Americans being detained out. But I certainly think since the announcement of this summit that initiative has been intensified. You know, I don't want to make a prediction, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were released before the summit actually took place. Again, this would be, I don't think the North Koreans would ever describe it as a concession, but again, maybe use the words setting the atmosphere for talks.
Yes.
Hee Jung-yang from Radio Free Asia. I have a question for the Swedish, the meeting in Sweden, the implication of the meeting in Sweden. Why would they, after the announcement of summit, why would they contact directly with the U.S. and hold a meeting in Sweden. Also, I understand that North Koreans have never mentioned about a summit directly to U.S. What would be the reason for that? Or-
What was the first question?
Question is why North Koreans and U.S. Meet or communicate directly through like UN channel or other
Why don't they?
intelligence.
Why don't they?
Right.
why don't they
Why don't they
communicate?
communicate directly and hold meeting in Sweden by using the protectorate power?
How do you know they haven't communicated directly? How do you know I'm just trying to make a point. We don't know whether they've communicated directly or not. How do you know they haven't?
You mentioned that there's an intelligence channel, I understand that, and there's a UN channel as well. But for the matter of a detainee, why would they not communicate directly regarding the matter of Americans detained in North Korea now that the summit has officially been kind of announced?
It's still the same question. How do you know they haven't communicated? Do you have good information that they haven't?
No, if I may paraphrase, what would be the implication of a Swedish meeting between the Swedish diplomat and the Young-ho?
Well, I think first and foremost, the Swedes have a presence, a physical presence in Pyongyang. So when I travel to Pyongyang, I don't go to the U.S. Embassy because there isn't one. There's a Swedish embassy, so I check in with them. So I think, the Swedes take that role quite seriously. And, if we go back to the case of Mr. Warmbier, I mean, during the course of a year, the Swedes were denied access to seeing him, the consular access, consular visits, and I think that was very upsetting for them. They tried very hard to get access. I think since that point, they have tried to become much more active in this issue. So it actually makes great sense to me that they've been carrying the ball on this issue for quite some time, and for the foreign minister to come to Stockholm, I'm sure that this was one of the top issues on the agenda. And if we do see an actual release, I think we'll have the Swedes to thank to a great extent. So the Swedes also have been playing a very positive and constructive role facilitating official dialogue, I think, and messaging, but also unofficial dialogue. So I think both sides, the U.S. and North Korea, feel quite comfortable engaging with the Swedes.
Wasn't the Swedish Prime Minister was here a few weeks ago and
That's
met
right.
President Trump?
And I think he mentioned in the press conference, he particularly thanked them. So this is an important point. I'm glad you brought it up, because I think as we move forward with this process and the challenges I've all mentioned, I really hope that the Trump administration, and it seems like they're doing that, looking to other governments who are our friends to play a positive role in helping us move the ball forward. The Swedes are certainly in that category. I think the Norwegians also, and the Finns are playing a role now. I think that's a very positive step.
My name is Kenichi from NHK. There is a lot of interest in where this summit will going to take place between Kim Jong-un and President Trump. So what is your idea on where it will, take place?
Mar-a-Lago.
Mar-a-Lago, that's a good idea.
No, I don't recommend that. I really have no idea. I don't even think it's been determined. I do think somewhere on the peninsula makes sense. There's also some rumors that Ri Young-ho's visit to Stockholm was a step towards maybe holding it in Europe, but I have no particular special insight on that. Do you, Joel?
No, not really. Sorry. Other questions, comments?
He has another question.
Oh, he has a question too.
Oh.
Alicia Rose, also from NHK. Since you mentioned that you were looking at the summit more as a launching process, I wanted to ask what you think a successful summit would look like and what role it would play in kickstarting the rest of the negotiations, maybe at a working level. And then also you said that we need a plan B, so what would be your idea for what a plan B would look like?
Okay. I mean, I think Suzanne touched on some of the things that would be deliverables from a summit. Things that wouldn't be deliverable would be a commitment to denuclearize right away. That's not going to happen. Things that would be deliverable would be, first, a set of principles that would govern U.S.-North Korean relations in the future. And there's lots of past declarations that can be mined for these principles. There was a declaration 1993, declaration in 2000, October 2000. There may be others. 2005, I keep forgetting that. 2005, the six-party talks. And the declarations would be, sort of general principles like respecting each other's sovereignty and, things along those lines. There would be more specific deliverables. For example, I would expect a summit to codify the North Korean commitment to a moratorium on nuclear and missile testing as long as negotiations last. There's an important point here, which I think they will have to deal with in a summit context, and that is that in the past, the lack of precise language on a moratorium on missile testing was a real problem, because that was the reason why the 2012 Leap Day deal between the United States and North Korea collapsed, because the North Koreans said it doesn't include space launch vehicles. The Americans said it did. And of course, the North Koreans just went ahead and tested anyway. So they're going to have to nail down that kind of detail on that. Beyond that, I think they need to also include something specific, and Suzanne could talk to this more given her Iran experience, something specific that says we're going to keep talking. We're going to have a continuous channel of communication. We're going to keep talking to try to work out this problem. In the past, in the U.S.-North Korean context, anytime something bad happens, talks stop. Can't do it that way. And the last thing, of course, is they need to launch a negotiating process, which includes negotiators, not President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Negotiators probably will have to be not just bilateral, but multilateral. Maybe the six-party talks makes a comeback. And if I was them, I would also include a provision for senior-level officials like foreign ministers to monitor the progress and periodically be involved to make sure that the process is moving forward. So those are just some ideas for what the outcome should be.
Yeah, I think we wrote about it. I don't think these are out of the realm of possibility. I think they're very practical ideas that could be achieved. And actually, in pre-summit preparations, they could be determined and agreed upon before President Trump and Kim Jong-un meet, and they just make it official.
Oh, Plan B. I think Plan B would be, gee, we can't, it may be that, for example, President Trump may have greater expectations for a summit than can be achieved. I think they probably know that ahead of time, though, because in the course of preparations, you would learn what might be possible, and there's always the chance that Kim Jong-un could issue on-the-spot guidance at a summit that would take things a little further. But Plan B would be, if we can't get all the substance we want, let's at least get a process started of talking where we can try to work on that. Other questions, comments?
Saying I think we're finished.
We're finished. We're getting like this sign? Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone. Hope this was helpful.